Thanks to Swami Kriyanandaji, our lives are filled with music like that. He wrote over 450 pieces of music, and we sing them all the time during our time when we are together. Someone once described Ananda Village, after visiting it for a little while, more like an operetta than a place, because we were constantly breaking into song. We're here to honor Master Paramhansa Yogananda, who was a Prem avatar, an avatar of love. We call him Master because he was master of himself. And I want to start by one of what I find to be one of his most beautiful poems. He did everything, but among the things that he did was to write beautiful, beautiful mystic poetry. And this I find to be one of the very most inspiring. It's called God's Boatman. I want to ply my boat many times across the gulf after death and return to earth's shores from my home in space. I want to load my boat with all those waiting thirsty ones who have been left behind, that I may carry them to opalescent pools of iridescent joy. There where my Father distributes his all desire-quenching liquid peace. Oh, I will come back again and again, crossing a million crags of suffering. With bleeding feet I will come, if need be, 1,000,000,000,000 times, as long as I know that one stray brother is left behind. I want thee, O God, that I may give thee to all. I want salvation, that I may give it to all. Free me then, O Lord, from the bondage of this body, that I may show others how they too can free themselves. I want thine everlasting happiness, but I want also to share it with others, that all my brothers may find the way to happiness forever and forever in thee. That's an immortal promise, someone of master's stature who has completed all of the necessity of reincarnation. There's nothing of his own to draw him back into this world except the purest love to return, as he stated again and again, crossing 1,000,000 crags of suffering if need be, as long as one stray brother is left behind. That's the heart of God, the heart of compassion, the heart of love, that does not think of itself, does not worry about, he said he was living in space. Now, space is a nicer place to live than on this plane. No traffic jams. It's a beautiful, expansive, infinite, joyful existence, but he is willingly wanting to come here to help all of us. And what a life he led. Oh, what a life he led. He was born, of course, here in India, and after his youth, he grew up mainly in Bengal and was trained there by a great, great guru, Sri Yukteswar, who in turn was the disciple of Lahiri Mahashaya, who in turn was the disciple of Babaji. And there's a reason for all of this lineage, because they came at the time of a changing of ages. From Sri Yukteswar was a great astrologer, a great mathematician, as well as being a completely self-realized soul. And he taught that there was a 24,000-year cycle of the yugas. And we are just during this time leaving the low cycle of Kali Yuga and coming into the next age of Dwapara Yuga. Now, at that time, there is a shift in world consciousness, and this lineage incarnated at that time to show us how we can make that shift and how we can make it in such a way that we will not only live appropriately, live spiritually, but probably more important for us, live happily in this age. It's not enough just to think of our spirituality as something that we practice a little bit at a time in our puja room or when we gather for a satsang, but then we leave that and we go out into the competitive daily battle, the jungle of life, and our ideals are no longer with us. They're left in the meditation room, and our ideals become crashing down because of the pressures of daily life. Part of the teachings that were brought is the time that we need to leave this society in order to find our spirituality has passed. That's a Kali Yuga model. Now we're in Dwapara Yuga. But let me talk a little bit about the mission of Yogananda especially, because at the time of this change of ages from Kali Yuga to Dwapara Yuga, Master, we call him Master, as I said, Master said that we are approaching an age where the energies of America in particular and India in particular need to unite to show a new way. Now, what does that mean? It isn't just political. It isn't country. It isn't lines and cultures even. It's that India is the guru of the world. Sanatana Dharma has been lived and taught here from ancient times. And that understanding that we all come from God, that we're an extension of God, that we're a part of God, and that we live only because of God's consciousness, and that ultimately the purpose of life is for us to return to the knowledge of who we truly are, to have the final awakening into what Master termed for his organization self-realization, the realization of our true self, of our soul. Now, India is the holder of those truths and has been the holder for millennia. We don't know really how far the culture of India goes back. One of the things that is going on in modern science is every 2 weeks they push the boundaries farther back and farther back. But we know that these teachings go back far before pre-Vedic times, a long, long way. So India, one could say, is the holder for the world of spirituality. Now, America, as we have come into this changing of ages, around 1700 to 1900, there was a bridge between Kali Yuga and Dwapara Yuga. And that is almost precisely the time that America came into being. The United States came into being. And so India has this ancient history and this ancient culture, but America has almost no history and no culture, unless you want to call 200 years or 250 years history and culture. One time a friend of mine was sitting in a little piazza in Italy and having a cup of coffee, and he was chatting with the waiter, and there was a building across the piazza with some nice columns and ornate carving. And my friend said, "Is that an old building?" And this waiter said, "Oh no, it's not very old. I doubt that it's even 1,000 years old." Now, to an American, 1,000 years old, we could only find rocks that were there. So America was born with a fresh slate, one might say. It was born with a different purpose and a different ideal. Now, very importantly, the birth of America took place because it wanted religious freedom. Swamiji has often said that the countries in South America came into existence basically because of the search for gold and the search for treasure. But the United States came into the existence because of the search for religious freedom. And so the potential is there in America, but it has a clean slate. Well, Master said that the joining together of these two great countries, India representing the Guru and America representing, of all places in the world, material efficiency and material success, those two coming together are what is going to be the marriage of two, not countries, but two ideals, two, one could say, vibrations. And those two coming together are going to create the pattern for the new age, which will have both deep spirituality and material efficiency. One might say, as a symbol of this, perhaps if you had to pick one person in relatively modern times that represented material efficiency and creativity and ideas for business, I suppose that you would pick Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple and the creator of all of these wonderful devices that we have. He and his partner were the ones who created the whole idea of us having personal computers. Before that, computers were huge and unwieldy. At any rate, Steve Jobs had an iPad. Naturally, he would have an iPad. And on that iPad, which is also a way to read electronic books, he had only one book. And that book was the autobiography of a yogi. At his death, after his death, at his memorial service, he gave away 500 copies of the autobiography of a yogi. In fact, the original order came to Ananda. But unfortunately, we were out of stock at that time, so they had to get them elsewhere. But I say that only because I want to show that one of Master's great, one could say, missions was to show that there was no problem in joining together material efficiency and deep spirituality. He loved some of the American spirit. One of the things that he loved was coming from a place where people understood reincarnation, but also had the thought of, oh, it takes so long. Oh, we can put it off because we'll just continue this journey. He said, Americans say, tomorrow? Tomorrow? Why not now? And he loved that immediate spirit. Reminds me of a joke that I'll tell. Of a friend of ours from Ireland told this joke. The Spanish ambassador was visiting the Irish ambassador. And after a few days of touring around, they became friends. And the Spanish ambassador said, we have a word in Spain, mañana, meaning tomorrow. We'll get to it tomorrow or the next day. Mañana, mañana. Don't have to hurry. And he said to this Irish ambassador, do you have any word like that in Ireland? And the Irish ambassador thought for a little while and he said, No, not with the same sense of urgency. But Master had a sense of urgency about him, an urgency to join these two cultures together, but more than that, to bring the spirituality of India, the deep, deep spirituality of India. But what he brought was a path, because when you have a religion of Hinduism and a teaching of yoga that has been around for thousands and thousands of years, it collects a huge body of teachings, some of which are beautiful and true and high, some of which are sort of true and maybe beautiful and not quite as high, and some of which are superstitions. And Master was able to cull out that which was true and high and eternal out of these great teachings, and he brought it to America, and then he was able to present it in such a way that it had an immediate impact, because he talked in terms of not just spirituality that was distant, not just the worship of different forms of God, but one of his first principles was that everyone in the world is motivated by exactly the same motivation. And that motivation is to be happy and to avoid pain. Not just humans, every creature in the world is motivated by those twin motivations. A little worm will crawl away from salt because it knows that if it stays there, it will shrivel up, so it will crawl away. Motivation is to be happy, in this case to live, so that individual motivation. But he combined that basic scientific teaching, one might say, with spirituality, because he said the soul is a part of God, and God's consciousness is joy. And so at the basis, everyone is seeking to reunite with their own joy again. But as that joy gets translated on this plane, it has not true joy, because joy is everlasting, is infinite. It has the echo of joy, which is happiness. I saw someone who said a definition for joy is happiness without a cause. Well, it's not a very good definition, but it at least gives a directional idea that happiness and joy are related together. And so Master taught that what we should do is to seek our own happiness. Now, you could think that that was a little bit of a selfish teaching, if we're just seeking our own happiness. But he also taught that happiness, the finding of happiness, is directional. At first, we seek it by putting out more energy, one might say. And so a lazy person will find happiness by perhaps seeking to get rich. Swami Kriyananda used this example. He said that if you had a relative who was a drinker and could never hold a job and just lazed around the house all the time, did nothing, and finally one day he said, "I'm tired of being poor, not having anything. I'm going to get a job, I'm going to stop drinking, and I'm going to get rich." Wouldn't everyone in this room say, "Wonderful, wonderful," because it's directional. That's his step for happiness. But if we heard Mother Teresa say, "I'm tired of being poor, I think I'm going to try to get rich," wouldn't everyone in this room say, "Oh, no, please don't, please don't"? Because we understand that wealth, that money, is not what is going to give us true happiness, but rather sharing, helping others is going to give us true happiness. And so as the refinement of consciousness expands, the desire to share with others the desire to give love to others. Yogananda was a Prem avatar, and he could walk down a street and shed love. He said, shoot people with the buckshot of your smiles. He always had clever, interesting ways of putting it. We had an incident that happened. Ananda has a community in Northern California, and nearby there's a little town about a half hour away. And we would go there, and that was the closest source of gasoline for our cars and trucks. And there was one place in the town that sold the least expensive gas. And so often we would go there, just because we didn't have a lot of money in those days. But we had to put up with the owner of this petrol station, who was very, very grumpy and always complaining and always a little bit nasty. But one day, some of our men were there filling up their truck with petrol, and this man saw a little picture, little wallet-sized picture of Yogananda hanging from the mirror. And he said, "Who is that?" And they explained it was Paramhansa Yogananda. And he started crying. This grumpy, nasty fellow started weeping. And he said, "I've always wondered who that man was. You see, I had I worked in a petrol station at the base of Mount Washington. And he would come and fill up his car, and he was the kindest, most loving person I've ever met." He didn't even know who he was. And here 30 or 40 years later, just the knowing who that was brought tears to his eyes. So Yogananda shedded love. He created love as a resonance in everyone's heart. But during the early years of his time in America, because he was bringing Indian spirituality, he did that with incredible dynamism. He came to America in 1920, and in the early 1920s, from about 1924 or 25 up to the early 1930s in America, he was the most popular speaker in the entire country because he was so dynamic and so filled with energy and new ideas. He would fill up the largest halls in America. Madison Square Garden was one of the largest, held 3,000 or 4,000 people. And he would give a lecture there, and it would not only be standing room only, but there would be lines going for 2 or 3 blocks of people who couldn't get in. And he would come out on the stage, someone described it, he would run out onto the stage with his long hair kind of flowing behind him. And he would say, "How is everyone?" And the audience learned to shout back, "Awake and ready." And then he'd say, "How feels everyone?" And they'd shout back, "Awake and ready." And he would say, "Good, now I can talk to you because you're awake and ready." And he would show little demonstrations of energy and power. One time in Boston, he was very powerful, even though he was not very tall. One time in Boston, he said, "I want to show you the power of energy." And he invited someone to come up, and he said, "I'll stand with my back against the wall, and I want you to press on me, and then just by arching my back, I will throw you backwards." And so he asked for a volunteer, but not just one volunteer. 8 big policemen came up on stage, and they were going to show this braggart how they were not going to yield. So they all lined up, and they were pressing against him. And with a twinkle in his eye, he said, "Are you ready?" And they said, "Yes, we're ready." He said, "Are you sure you're ready?" "Yes, we're ready." And he arched his back, and they all fell backwards into the pit, the orchestra pit. He did sometimes those demonstrations of, really it wasn't just physical power, of course, it was yogic power. He did little demonstrations like that. He could do any miracle that he wanted, but he did not want to draw people just because they would come and see miracles. So he would do little demonstrations just to show the validity of these teachings. But during those times when he was traveling around America, he was incredibly dynamic. He would do lecture after lecture after lecture. In between, he would be doing interviews and meeting with clubs and constantly busy. Because he called it, he was stirring the ether. He was planting these seeds in the minds and in the consciousness of America especially, but throughout the West. And then in 1948, he had been working for a long time on his great book, Autobiography of a Yogi. And that came out in 1948. And after that time, he didn't do quite so much outwardly. That latter period of his life was more deep introspection and wisdom. He said that of the qualities of God, the ones that he most expressed were love, which we've been talking about, joy, and wisdom. And so that early time was the combination of joy and energy and love. But then after the autobiography came out, it was as if that especially became his emissary to the world. Now, the Autobiography of a Yogi has been called one of the 10 most important spiritual books of the century, probably ever written. One of the 10 most important. In some countries, only 3 or 4 years ago, it came out in 1948, only a few years ago, it was the #1 bestseller of nonfiction in Italy. It continues and continues. So in America, growing up, if you have any tendency toward spirituality, any tendency toward meditation or the teachings of India, almost everyone not only buys and reads the Autobiography of a Yogi, but begins to give it away to their family and their friends. And it has spread throughout the consciousness of the West, not just America, but the West and all over. It's now spreading and spreading also here in India. And that autobiography is one of the greatest statements of the consciousness of a true saint, of a true avatar that has ever been written. Devi ji and I travel around, and one of the things that we most love is to hear people tell about how they found the autobiography and what a difference it made in their life. We heard one story recently where a young man, he was about 18 or 19, looked at the book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and for some reason, the picture on the cover, which normally attracts almost everyone, but for him, for some reason, it was a little off-putting, and he didn't want to read that book. And then about a year later, he was moving some boxes. He lived in a college kind of dormitory space, and there was an attic where students had left things, and so he was moving some boxes, and there was a book there that kind of fell forward and kind of bumped up, and he started looking at it. The book didn't have any cover on it, and so he started looking at it and read a couple of pages, and he just loved it. And so he took it because it had just been left there abandoned, and he started reading it, and then after some time he came to some of the picture pages, and he saw there the picture of Yogananda, and he had a good laugh because that was the very book that he rejected. So I could see, kind of visualize Yogananda up in ether up in the astral plane saying, well, I know this fellow is really wanting this, so I'm going to have to rip the cover off of one of the books in order to allow him the chance to read it. So these stories of how the autobiography of a yogi have come into people's lives and changed their lives. I know for me, it was the reading of that book that marked the watershed moment of my entire life. Before that, I was searching for truth. I was searching for a sense of what are the limits of consciousness. I tried to understand it by studying psychology in college. That was my degree. But somehow, seeing rats run through a maze did not satisfy my need to know how expansive consciousness could be. And so I was still hungry, and it was finally finding that book that gave me a life direction. And within a month or so, I met my lifelong teacher and guide, Swami Kriyanandaji, who was Master's direct disciple, and he has guided our lives and the lives of hundreds, thousands of people. I'm eternally grateful to him. He has shared Yoganandaji with us. So Yogananda came to knit together these two great energies, the spirituality of the East and the practicality of the West. And we see now kind of American practicality. Makes me a little sad, honestly, to see all the malls and all the shopping brands and all of that. But it's a phase that has to happen. There was another mission that Yogananda came to knit together, and that was to show that at the basis of all true religions, fundamentally, they are one and the same. And so he did interpretations of the Bible to show that the biblical teachings of Jesus, he said he wanted to show that the original teachings of Jesus Christ as taught in the Bible and the original teachings of Krishna as taught in the Gita were fundamentally the same. And so he interpreted both of those great scriptures to show that Jesus was not, well, he was a yogi, put it that way. That, in fact, Master said, and it's fairly common teaching here in India, but has only slowly grown acceptance by the fringe in the West, that during the missing years in the Bible, Jesus came here and spent 17 years in India and Tibet, Nepal, studying and absorbing these great teachings, and then brought them back. But it's all, again, part of this great wave of God's consciousness, which is meant in order to join together the world. As we move from Kali Yuga to Dwapara Yuga, things begin to join together. In Kali Yuga, one could say that the general consciousness is low. It's like when the temperature is low and you have a pan of water, that water freezes, doesn't it? And when water is frozen, you can cut it into little cubes, and you can separate those cubes, and you can call one of them Hinduism, and another Islam, and another Christianity, and another Buddhism. They're separate, and you can keep countries apart, and you can keep people apart, and you can keep languages apart. You can keep everything separate. But then when the temperature rises, imagine on your pan you have these nice little separate chunks of ice, and now the temperature is rising and they're beginning to melt. You can't keep water separate. It's going to join together. You can't keep the cultures of America and India separate. We're going to join together no matter what the visa officials say. we're still going to join together. And that's already beginning to happen more and more. And that's going to accelerate. So the things that people have tried to keep separate will no longer be able to be kept separate. Right now, I hope you've turned your mobiles off. But if you had your mobile on and it rang, you would not know until you looked there whether that call was coming from across the street or from around the other side of the world. That distance, that separation has been taken out of life for us. That's going to continue. And ultimately, we're going to see that all people on this planet are one nation under, we're all children of God. Yogananda predicted that, he said, first there was the United States of America. Then he said will come the United States of Europe. We're already seeing the European Union. Then he said there would be the United States of Asia, that the countries of Asia would join together and not have such separate borders. And then he said finally, there will be the United States of the world. And that is the future that we're moving toward. But Yogananda came to draw together, to be a bridge builder, to show that America and India working together will produce a new culture. We have seen that culture in our Ananda villages, and it's a beautiful culture that the religions of the world, the sectarianism and the fighting will begin to die down, and we will see that self-realization, or the realization of the nature of our own soul, our own true unity with God, would come to unite all religions. So we're in a very, very glorious age, and I bow again and again to my great Guru Preceptor, Paramhansa Yogananda Ji, for bringing this beautiful teaching and bringing the love and joy that makes it attractive to our hearts.
Good afternoon, everyone, and namaste. I also feel so fortunate to share our love and our understanding of our great Guru with all of you. Swami Kriyananda tells a very interesting story. He said when he was a young monk living with Yogananda Ji, he would, in his mind, try to understand the limitless quality of Yogananda's consciousness. He had read, of course, Autobiography of a Yogi, in which Master describes his experience of cosmic consciousness, where his consciousness spanned the farthest reaches of infinity. And yet here he was, a simple Bengali teacher come to America, laughing with them, joking with them, and Swamiji would try to understand. He's standing there in front of me, and yet I know he's so much more than this physical body. And once, I don't feel this is adjusted quite right, is it? Is it okay for you to hear? Okay. Once Swamiji was just trying to perceive the expansiveness of Master's consciousness and trying to affirm within his own mind, you are not that body, you are much more. And just at that point, Yogananda Ji came up to Kriyananda and with a little smile handed him an apple, as though to say, Yes, I am beyond this body, but I also come to you in the form of your Guru because I love you, because God has asked me to lead you out of the ocean of delusion into the freedom of cosmic consciousness. And so there is this great paradox between the Guru as an infinite consciousness and the beautiful form he comes to us in, the form in which he teaches us, laughs with us, cries with us perhaps, but guides us always as an emissary of God. In the Bhagavad Gita, there's the great chapter in the middle of the Gita, chapter 11, in which Arjuna begs Krishna. He said, I see you as my cousin, my friend, my playmate, and now my charioteer. But I know, Krishna, that you are so much more. Reveal to me your cosmic image. And in that glorious, glorious chapter in which Krishna blesses Arjuna with cosmic vision, and he sees Krishna in his cosmic form. He sees him with thousands of eyes and numberless heads and going bigger and bigger and bigger. And he said, my hair is standing on end. And then finally, when Arjuna cannot absorb anymore, he said, please, my Lord, appear to me once more in a form that I can relate to. And this is why the Gurus come. They are one with the divine love, with the divine light. But unless they come to us in human form, it is hard for us to perceive. And so the very sweetness of that act, I will come to you in a form that you recognize so that you can trust me, so that you can feel comfortable with me. We, as Jyotish mentioned, we were disciples and friends and students of Swami Kriyananda for more than 45 years. And he was a great in soul direct disciple of Yoganandaji. And in those years, I can't tell you the number of times that we shared moments with him, having tea, going for walks, having dinner parties with groups of people, and of course the spiritual training as well. But our human nature needs human forms to relate to. And once someone said to Yoganandaji, if God is infinite, how could he possibly care about you and me, our little bitty lives? What difference could it possibly make to him? And Yoganandaji's answer was perfect. He said, your concept of infinity is too small. God is infinitely large as well as infinitely small. And in that sense, your life is of absolute importance to him. And so when we come to this concept of a Prem avatar, of an incarnation of love, I think it's important for us to understand the difference between what we know of as human love and what is divine love. Because they are not different in essence, they are only different in degree. And just as the love a little girl has for her little toy doll is not different in essence from the love that Divine Mother has for each one of us, it's just a more limited expression. And so when we come to understand the nature of this divine love, once we feel even a touch of it, it changes our lives forever. I have seen people whose hearts were hardened, whose hearts were closed, who had had many disappointments in life, and just an hour in the company of Swami Kriyananda, and you could see once more that that hope and that softness in their heart was returning. Because, as we were saying, infinite love that the great masters express is not separate from human love. It's just a higher expression. And one might say that sometimes divine love is described as impersonal. Well, what does that mean, impersonal love? It doesn't mean cold, it doesn't mean aloof. Swami Kriyananda describes it so beautifully. He says, impersonal love is simply giving without any thought of what you get back. And so the great saints, all they do is want to give, want to show us the potential of our own capacity to love, never with the thought, and all human of what they will receive. All human love has at least some aspect of what will I get back if I'm kind to this person, if I am serviceful to my family, then they will love me, then they will be appreciative. But the examples of divine love never ask, what will I receive back? There was a beautiful story that happened a few years ago at our meditation retreat in Ananda Village. It was late one Saturday evening, and our Guru Bhais, the members, were in the kitchen of our retreat preparing meal, because we always have a large meal together on Sundays after our satsang. And so these women were working late at night preparing a meal, and a woman walked in, someone they didn't know, and she said, I must tell you my story. And she said, I am not a follower of this path. I don't even know what you believe, but I live in the area. And a few weeks ago I visited, and I saw a little picture of, it was Master. She didn't know. She just said that man with the long hair. And I saw that picture, and I was so taken by it, I bought it. I didn't even know what his name was. And I put it on a little shelf by my door at home. And this woman went on, I've had a very difficult life. As a young woman, I was engaged to be married, and the man I was to marry was diagnosed with a terminal disease, and he died before we were able to be married, and I closed my heart down. And then some years went by, and once again, I was to marry a very nice man, and then unexpectedly, he was in a car accident and he was killed. And she said, I just thought, I can't go on living. I can't, my heart has been hurt too much in this lifetime. And she said, I made up my mind that I was going to end my life. I was going to get my car keys, get into my car, and just drive off a bridge nearby where I live, which there's a deep ravine beneath it. And I just wanted to end my life. I got my car keys, I started to walk out the door, and that little picture, just as big as a wallet size, all of a sudden, this man whose name I don't know, whose teachings I don't follow, that picture began to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and it stood in front of my door, and it looked at me with so much love and so much compassion, but also shaking his head, do not take your life. And she said, I fell on my knees and weeping with gratitude and joy for that experience. And she said, I don't know what you people believe here at Ananda Ashram, but I had to come and tell you my story. We never saw her again. She didn't follow our path as far as we know. But that kind of love that sees the needs of every individual. There's the beautiful line in Yoganandaji's mystic poem, Samadhi, in which he says, the sparrow, each grain of sand, falls not without my sight. And I think many of us in this room are followers of Yogananda, Some maybe are coming to hear of him for the first time. But whatever your life path is, if you have another teaching you follow, if you follow no teachings whatsoever, I want you to remember that there is a source of love and guidance in this world that is yours if you reach out for it. No one is left unattended in the eyes of the Divine Mother, in the eyes of God. Once someone said to one of Yoganandaji's disciples, said to him, "Master, when I see you, I only see Divine Mother." And Master didn't deny it and say, "Oh no, don't think that way." He was walking with a little cane and he struck this disciple on the leg and he said, "Then act accordingly." Meaning, if that's what you feel, then act that way. He didn't deny that he was one with the Divine Mother. And Master worshiped God in the form of the Divine Mother because he said, "Mother is closer than the Father." And so this great incarnation came, as Jyotish was saying, at a change of ages. And he brought great teachings and he brought techniques for liberation, meditation, Kriya Yoga. As it says in autobiography, Kriya Yoga is the most effective tool for liberation through self-effort ever given to mankind. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. And I have lived in Ananda ashrams most of my adult life, starting in 1969, many decades ago. And I have seen thousands of lives changed by following this path. And I have seen thousands of lives changed by people who just knew of this path. And I have seen in the lives of family and friends who don't follow this path at all, but for whom I have prayed for Master's intercession. I have seen their lives changed. Master said, "Whoever comes with an open heart, no one goes home empty-handed." This was his promise, the promise of divine love. And so in this age we find ourselves in, it's very easy to lose hope and lose faith in humanity. Once Swamiji, as a young monk, was riding and doing some business, and he was driving somewhere, and he saw a hitchhiker, a very poorly dressed man, and he stopped the car and said, "Come in." And he asked the man where he wanted to go, and the man began giving him a story about how he had lost his job and how his wife was ill, how he was badly in need of money. And he asked Swami for his money. Swami took out his wallet. He didn't have much, but he gave the man most of what he had. And the man said, "Please give me your address because I don't want you to lose faith in humanity." And Swami, who was a wise man, said, "If I would have had faith in humanity, I would have lost it long ago. I give you this money because I have faith in God, and I know God will give this money back to me." And in fact, that's exactly what happened. He never heard from that man again, but because Swami had given his life in devotion and service to Yoganandaji, the money came back many times over. But it's easy to lose faith in the power of goodness in the world we live in. And for me, that's part of the reason that being a disciple of Master, sharing his teachings, is the most fulfilling thing I can imagine to do with one's life. Because I know he awakened in me the power, the belief in the power of divine love, divine goodness, which is always there, but we lose sight of it behind the vicissitudes of humanity. And so these great ones come not only to bring the liberating techniques of yoga, but they come to awaken us to the power of divine love, which is present everywhere in the universe, which is present within us, and to help us believe in our own divinity and our own depth of consciousness. And so for all of us gathered here today, we hope that our sharing will awaken in you a desire to explore these teachings, to read Autobiography of a Yogi if you haven't yet read it, to feel that grace in your life that is never ending. The sparrow falls not without God's sight. And Yoganandaji came, he was a son of India, but he was a citizen of the world. And he knew no boundaries, he knew no strangers. He gave his heart to all whom he met. Once Swami said Yogananda was driving in his car, and they were driving in Los Angeles, and all of a sudden he said, "Stop the car." And he got out and he ran into this very shabby little store. And he began, it just was sort of odds and ends. He began buying things, putting them into a basket, more and more and more. None of the disciples could figure out what in the world he was doing. But finally he went to pay for his purchases. And the woman looked very worried and agitated. And when she totaled up the amount and Master handed her over the money, she burst out crying. And she said, "I badly needed this exact sum of money. My daughter is in the hospital. She's ill. I couldn't pay my bills." She said, "Surely God has sent you to me today." Master didn't know that woman. I doubt that he ever saw her again. But when she said, "Surely God has sent you here today," this is true. Surely God sent Yoganandaji into the world at this time to awaken in our hearts divine love, the divine love he radiated to all, and that we never forget that though God is cosmic, he is also human and personal. And every time we reach out our hand in compassion, in service, in caring for another human being, God's love flows through us. And this becomes a beautiful garden of flowers that shine their various colors, their various forms, their religions, their cultures, their all the differences that seem real, and yet none of them are real. We are all God's children. We are children of the Divine Mother who loves us with a love that we can't even imagine. This is what Yogananda came to awaken in us. And I hope that you will feel the seeds of that love growing in your own heart. God bless you.